2018 has been quite a year for Dark Souls, with Dark Souls Remastered coming out and giving us what are arguably the best and worst versions of the game released thus far, respectively its PC and Switch versions, which show that whatever frame rate and resolution you played on, Dark Souls is still a damn good time. This is hardly news. Everybody likes Dark Souls and is at the same time certain that no one else likes it. Gamers who like to complain that game journalists hate difficult games? Check. Game journalists? Check. Gaming YouTubers? Also check. For all of its reputation of being a punishing game that only the most skilled players can get through, it may very well be the most mainstream game of the last two console generations. It's unclear how many of the people who know about Dark Souls have actually played it. Achievement statistics suggest that less than 2/3 of those who do play it get past the second boss, and that even less make it to the end of the game. But Dark Souls lore channels are still making bank on YouTube, and the game is so often awkwardly forced into headlines for the sake of virality that an entire Twitter account exists to document this phenomenon. On the surface, that Dark Souls manages to appeal to so many gaming communities is not hard to explain. It takes place in a dark fantasy world where everybody is either undead or a monster, where society has broken down completely and humanity itself teeters on the brink of destruction. So you know, a lot like 2018. Presented in this way, there seems to be very little place in the game for social commentary that could alienate anyone, which is probably why it can be enjoyed by people of such a wide spectrum of opinion, and so it seems weird to try and make a political video about Dark Souls. But you know me, I'll push my politics into just about anything, so join me now as we explore the politics of Dark Souls. A word about what this video is and isn't. First of all, this is most certainly not a lore video. I'm not going to examine every single item description and every single line of dialogue to try and piece together the exact role Cathay had in the fall of Ulasil or anything of the sort. Games communicate more through what they have you do and how they present their worlds to us than through the precise esoteric facts of their stories. What I want to explore in this video is what ideas Dark Souls presents to the vast swath of players who, by and large, are not lore hunters. Most of all, this video makes no pretense of being objective. Not only do such pretenses never stand up to scrutiny, but it is impossible to say anything real or interesting about a work or its ideas without taking a stand on these ideas. Insofar as this video seeks to examine politics, it will be highly political in and of itself. And lastly, remember that whatever the conclusions, a game's politics don't automatically reflect on its audience. You're not a progressive for playing a game with leftist ideas, and you're not a reactionary for playing a game with right-wing ideas. The entire purpose of analyzing these ideas is to understand, for better or worse, what a game is trying to say, and why these things resonate with us. It's not wrong to play any given game, regardless of what it says. It's only wrong to not want to understand.
There's no telling how much longer your world and mine will remain in contact.
Not much is told to us when we first start playing Dark Souls, and really not that much is said at any point afterwards. A cryptic intro scene tells us of an ancient battle between gods, humans, and certain dark forces on one side against dragons on the other, from which the human side emerged victorious. However, this victory did not suffice to ensure the longevity of the human race. The light in Lordran, Dark Souls' setting, is dying out, and more undead appear. In fact, contrary to what would be implied by this intro, there doesn't seem to be anything but undead in Lordran. Every single human we meet over the course of the game is somewhere in the process of becoming hollowed, the name given to those undead who lose all humanity and can only mindlessly attack all they encounter. The only humanity seen in the game is the quantity that players can use to kindle bonfires and gain more Estus flasks, the game's healing items, and enlist the help of other characters in their fight. Humanity can refer to two objects in the game, either consumable items or a stat recorded by a counter next to the player's health and stamina meters, the former turning into the latter upon use. The item description for this consumable humanity reads, "This black sprite is called humanity, but little is known about its true nature. If the soul is the source of all life, then what distinguishes the humanity we hold within ourselves?" In other words, what's special about being human, or indeed about being undead? What is the innate thing we have that is lost once we succumb to the curse? Dark Souls and its spiritual ancestor Demon Souls came out in 2009 and 2011 retrogradely, 2 years that delineate a time in gaming that was dominated by the grim, bleak, and arguably edgy, probably in no small part due to the success of The Dark Knight and the ensuing desire for all things to be made adult, in a very narrow meaning of the word. Dark Souls is by no means the most egregious offender in this respect, thanks in large part to its subtle storytelling, vaguely told through bits of dialogue, item descriptions, and its environments. But at certain points, the game's writing slips, and its sleight of hand gives way to nails on chalkboard. This is perhaps best exemplified by the Depths, the dungeon most players will fight through on their way from the first Bell of Awakening in the Undead Parish to the second one in Blighttown. This is widely recognized as one of the best places in the game to gather humanity, due to the high density of one of the enemy types most likely to drop it. Roads. You can just see the meeting where they decided on this. The Dark Souls design team all gathered together in an office asking what enemy should give players lots and lots of humanity, and Miyazaki smugly stroking his chin, exclaiming, "Rats!" But this is more than just an attempt at irony or empty shock value. The second part of the puzzle is not given to us until much later in the game, during the very last part of the Artorias of the Abyss DLC. Picture this. At what is likely the last part of the game players will tackle before heading on to the last boss, they fight through a forest full of ancient beings, take on a legendary hero who turns out to have succumbed to villainy, fight through a doomed city, and then see this. These familiar figures we've constantly seen through dozens of hours of Dark Souls here in the Abyss, the source of all humanity. You could write this off as more attempts at shock value, but the reason why this placement is shocking, why it's so effective, is the subtext. Humanity isn't something inherent to us, not something natural at all. The so-called undead curse that's been inflicted on the people of Lordran is in fact nothing of the sort. The undead are not regressing from humanity, but on the contrary, are shedding the illusion of being anything but ravenous, violent monsters. This disdain for humanity is highly political, but it doesn't seem that way to most people, since it is exhibited, to varying degrees, by people from very different political and ideological standpoints. The secret here is that this hatred isn't really for every single human. There aren't a lot of Hectors and Isaacs in our world who feel contempt for all humans, even to a degree themselves. Hatred in general doesn't work that way. Most racists will eagerly point out how well they get along with black or Jewish people, whether or not that's actually true. In the same way, a disdain for humanity is not quite that. It too allows for exceptions. It's a disdain for a certain majority of humans, a majority that, fabricated or not, those expressing such disdain find unpleasant or beneath them. It is, in short, a hatred of the masses, whatever the speaker might imagine these masses may be. Maybe they're non-white, ignorant and violent, maybe they're racist southerner coal miners who think immigrants are stealing their jobs. Either way, it's a hatred that crosses party boundaries. It's a class hatred, a hatred by middle class and rich people directed at poor and working class people, not always consciously but always implied, and almost always tinted by race. Dark Souls, to the best of my knowledge, never mentions class or race during the entirety of its runtime, but the secret is that it doesn't have to. The stereotypical images of certain class or racial groups are so deeply ingrained in our society that it can formulate ideas about them even while never naming them specifically. We now have an idea of what Dark Souls thinks about humanity, but what does it think about the undead? If Dark Souls is the story of humanity regressing, or, as we've established, returning to an undead form, what does it imagine this form is like? How does it conceive of our lowest state, our nightmarish yet inevitable fate in its dying world? On this end of things, Dark Souls is much more heavy-handed. We begin the game in the Undead Asylum, where we're instructed to kill far-gone hollows to hone our skills for later. The hollows here act like the stereotypes of mentally ill people that are often seen in horror, devoid of all rational thought, ugly, wearing tattered clothes, mindlessly pounding walls or the ground, laying in filth. Here the commentary on tutorials and following instructions that was attempted by games like Far Cry, Blood Dragon and The Path is made much more subtly, although probably unintentionally. By the time we meet an enemy who we would be justified in defending ourselves from, we're already predisposed to killing our erstwhile fellow inmates. But if those held at the asylum are violent and dangerous, what can be said of those who keep them there? The closest we have to a warden here is the asylum demon, a being of pure evil who guards the key to the asylum's main gate and who attacks us as soon as we approach it. There's no contrast here. Those interned at the asylum are violent and evil, and those who guard them are as well. And as below, so above. Both sides is a constant theme in Dark Souls. Not one character that we meet throughout our journey in Lordran can be said to be unambiguously positive. Not even the most incidental characters, the shopkeepers, let us go without their own take on a villainous laugh. Both of the more likable NPCs, Soler and Sigmar, will very likely die in a first playthrough, but even if you go through the hoops required to making sure they survive, they go mad and, in Sigmar's case, even have to be put down. Again. Time and time again, everything seemingly good and kind in Dark Souls is turned on its head. But perhaps the best examples of this theme of duplicity, of the idea that nothing truly good exists, are found in the stories of two important characters, Artorias and Gwyndolin. Artorias is a name we hear quite often over the course of Dark Souls' main campaign. One of Gwyn's 4 knights, Artorias is said to have braved the abyss and to have given his life to contain its evil. To defeat Gwyn, we must traverse the abyss ourselves, and to do this, we must defeat his companion, the great wolf Sif, who guards his grave and his ring, the Covenant of Artorias, which allows us to survive in the abyss. Thus, in the minds of a Dark Souls player, Artorias is built up as a tragic and noble hero who gave his life for the greater good, analogous to Metal Gear Solid's boss or Final Fantasy VII's. But, like everything in Dark Souls, the truth turns out to be far more grim. If you've played Artorias of the Abyss, you'll know that after getting through the DLC's Ancient Forest, we actually fight Artorias, who, surrounded by dark energy, has clearly been corrupted by the Abyss. Before his downfall, Artorias was given the nickname Abyss Walker. He was single-minded in his hatred of Katha and his Dark Wraiths, and him succumbing to their influence is clearly meant to serve as some great irony. Artorias, the Abyss Walker, the one who made a covenant with the Beasts of the Abyss, is now utterly consumed by it. If ever Horseshoe Theory was given video game form, this would be it. Did I mention this was the era of everyone mimicking the Dark Knight? As an aside, if players go through Artorias of the Abyss first, free Sif there, and only then go to fight Sif in the main game, the Great Wolf identifies the person who helped them, and then lets out a howl of pain, realizing that he must kill the only other friendly face he knows in the world, since no matter how Sif feels about you, he cannot let you defile his master's grave. It's probably the only genuinely human moment in Dark Souls, and it comes from an oversized wolf. Both the idea that the more we fight something, the more we are consumed by it, and the idea that no true heroes exist, that we're all equally capable of villainy, are deeply political ideas. The axiom that both opposite opinions on virtually any topic are equally false, simply by virtue of the fact that advocating for one side leads one to behave like the other, and that the truth is always in the middle, is a call to preserve the status quo. For what else decides where this center that legitimizes our opinions lies? If everyone is equally bad, then everyone is also equally good. So why should anyone ever change anything in the world? Might as well follow the advice of the person who introduced us to this world and stay rotting in our cells.
But there's no salvation here. You'd have done better to rot in the undead asylum. But too late now. Well, since you're here, let me help you out.
What is, when it comes right down to it, Dark Souls' main story? What is the essential path that, short of using glitches or other exploits the developers likely did not foresee, we must walk to reach the end? Assuming we pick the Master Key as our starting gift, we can immediately, upon reaching Firelink Shrine, defeat the Bell Gargoyles and Quelaag, in whatever order we please, ring the 2 Bells of Awakening, enter Sand's Fortress, and defeat the Iron Golem. From there, we're taken to Anor Londo, defeat Ornstein and Smaug, and finally get the ability to fast travel using the Lord Vessel. With this newfound ability, we head back to Lordran, defeat Sif to access the Four Kings boss fight, use the Lord Vessel to access the layers of Nito, Seath, no not that one, and the Bed of Chaos, and finally take on Gwyn himself. Dark Souls is good enough at signposting that the path to Anor Londo can be sussed out simply through idle exploration. But once we get there, what focuses us? What explains to us our mission, our purpose in the world, now that we have seen most of it and can pretty much go anywhere we please? The answer comes in the form of Guinevere. A princess, magical and conventionally attractive, tells us that we are chosen, that we are the champions who must defeat the forces of evil and save the world from Gwyn. It's like something straight out of a fairy tale, and if that seems unlikely given what we know about Dark Souls, that's because it is. As written in the description of the Darkmoon Blade Covenant Ring, Gwyndolin, all too aware of his repulsive, frail appearance, created the illusion of a sister Guinevere, who helps him guard over Anor Londo. An unmasking of these deities would be tantamount to blasphemy. And indeed, if we attack Guinevere, she disappears, exposing her as an illusion. But not only that, every single enemy in Anor Londo disappears as well. The only things that remain are the Darkmoon Knightess, who guided us towards Ornstein and Smaug in the first place, a couple of other hostile NPCs, and Gwyndolin. Hey folks, this next part contains a rather detailed discussion of transphobia, including a brief discussion of anti-trans violence. If this isn't something you would like to deal with at this point, please refer to the timestamps in the description to skip this part, or just come back to it later. Who is Gwyndolin? The Moonlight Road description reads, "The power of the moon was strong in Gwyndolin, and thus he was raised as a daughter." Many have taken this to mean Gwyndolin is trans, which has led to accusations of transphobia, since Gwyndolin is referred to as he often. What's known as misgendering, a harmful act which attempts to invalidate a trans person's identity and humiliate them for not conforming with their assigned gender. There's quite a rich body of work on this question. I highly recommend reading the excellent articles written on this by trans women, rather than the knee-jerk reactions of other types of people who refuse to reckon with Dark Souls' more questionable parts. In particular, I would like to call attention to Isla Arthur's article in The Orbital, in which she explores not just Gwyndolin's characterization, but the significance of their subsequent fate in Dark Souls 3. You can find links to this and other articles in the video's description. However, I would like to argue that the way Gwyndolin is characterized is actually even worse than that. Note that it's not that Gwyndolin was assigned a certain gender at birth, contrary to their actual gender. It's not that Gwyndolin's gender was at odds with some antiquated idea of gender being tied to certain sexual characteristics. Gwyndolin was made to identify as a woman, or a girl, due to their affinity with the moon. This was forced on Gwyndolin. We also have cause to believe that Gwyndolin did not accept this identity. It's been suggested that the fact that they're referred to as a he could simply be misgendering, but one bit of dialogue contradicts this. Upon defeating the Darkmoon Knightess after the illusion of Guinevere is dispelled, the Knightess will refer to Gwyndolin as a master. While in certain instances master can be gender neutral, several characters in the game, for example Quelaag, Priscilla and Rhea, are referred to as a gender-specific madam or mistress in instances where master may have been applicable. Given that the Darkmoon Knightess reveres Gwyndolin, it is unlikely that she would misgender them. Therefore, we can only conclude that Gwyndolin is either a man or non-binary. Either way, they're not a woman. The implications of this are rather gruesome. The theme of supposed gender confusion leading to villainy is quite common in media, and is one of the more sinister ways transgender people are portrayed therein. The most infamous example may be Sleepaway Camp, but there are many others, including quite recent ones. Just last year, Remothered Tormented Fathers came out and was initially one of the more pleasant surprises of the year for me, until it turned out that this trope exactly is at the heart of its plot. If this seems like an exaggeration, consider this. Not only do trans people in our society suffer intense discrimination, humiliation, and violence, but at the time of writing, the trans panic defense, the argument that assailants deserve lighter sentences or even acquittal because they were panicked into committing a violent crime by a trans person making an unwanted advance at them, is still legally acceptable in 47 states in the USA. One of the more common slurs for trans people suggests that they are trying to trick men into having sex with them without knowing they're trans. The idea of cis people being tricked and victimized by trans people, or that trans people are somehow villainous, would already be awful and bigoted under normal circumstances. But given where trans rights are in this day and age, it is incredibly irresponsible and, one could easily argue, violent. That the moon is invoked in Gwyndolин's characterization is an interesting coincidence. Isla Arthur notes that a lot of Dark Souls conforms with the two guys on the moon meme. A meme which typifies bad sophomoric writing by saying, if there were two guys on the moon, and one of them killed the other with a rock, would that be fucked up or what? A lot of the revelations in Dark Souls about the evil and corrupt nature of all things are a lot like that. Shock for the sake of shock value alone, with little to justify it in deep narrative terms. If Artorias invokes the Dark Knight, Gwyndolин's story arc invokes, more than anything else, Game of Thrones. There are few things worse in game critique than looking at a game's storytelling separate from its mechanics. If the ultimate directive of movie writing is show, don't tell, game designs would probably be, as Brenda Romero put it, the mechanic is the message. This isn't the strict rule, of course. Just like movies sometimes have good exposition dialogue, good games can still use cutscenes effectively. However, the messages imparted by these more conventional storytelling techniques will likely never be as effective as those absorbed simply by playing the game. At this point, we should probably dispel a common myth about Dark Souls, that it's difficult. Now, this isn't me being macho and trying to pretend I easily breezed through the game. There are hard things about Dark Souls, and you can certainly choose to play it in ways that enhance its difficulty. But you could only call it difficult if you've never tried to get through a truly hard game. As written by Brenna Hillier in a fantastic article titled, appropriately, Crash Bandicoot is hard, Dark Souls is not, nostalgia is clouding your eyesight and you're getting old, you don't need amazing twitch reflex skills to play Dark Souls. If you have them, you're playing in easy mode. What you do need to play Dark Souls is a willingness to explore, to go slow, to play around with builds and different playstyles, to observe and plot, to piece together fragments of information, to read the environment, to die and to die again and again and again and again, and learn something every single time until you grow into your unstoppable glory. What you do need is time, and that's where the inaccessibility actually does come in, just as you might need time to acquire platforming skills. Except that, unlike platforming skills, anybody can learn to equip such and such a combination of gear, to peek around corners before stepping out, and to run like hell. Getting good at Dark Souls is ultimately about learning rules, and the difficulty comes to a great extent from the fact that these rules do not conform to those that a good decade of the AAA games industry making pretty much the same action game over and over again has taught us. To quote, Crash Bandicoot is hard, Dark Souls is not, nostalgia is clouding your eyesight and you're getting old, again. The vast majority of big-budget action video games can be completed by randomly mashing buttons, even though they may offer depth and difficulty well beyond that for those who care to seek it. Regenerating health, shields, large health pools, increasingly powerful attacks, all of these design conventions have become the accepted standard because they mean a very large pool of people can play at least the first few hours of a game and feel vaguely competent. The Dark Souls games aren't like that. They're more like the old coin-ops and character platformers, in that you can only take 2 or perhaps 3 hits before you lose a life, and you just have to not take those hits. But these days, we do not expect an enemy to one-hit kill us in a modern action game, and so when it happens, many of us switch the game off in disgust and call it inaccessible and bad design. Most games have the rule that should you press a button to do something and then see the enemy do something that makes you regret it, you can immediately press another button to cancel your bad move. Dark Souls says, no, own up to your mistake. Oh my god. Alright, I really can't fault anyone but myself for that. Most games have the rule that, unless you really screw up, individual enemies or even small groups of them can't be a serious threat. Dark Souls cackles maniacally as two skeletons stunlock you in a corner. I almost want to try and let someone who's never played an action game try to play Dark Souls and see whether or not they do much better than people who've played every major release in the last couple of console generations. This connects to another misconception about Dark Souls, that it is in any way a power fantasy. For that term to have any meaning, it cannot simply apply to any game where you attain power or overcome challenges. A power fantasy is about reaching a level of overwhelming power, to a point where nothing can challenge you. It may be a long and arduous road, but eventually, in a power fantasy, even the strongest creatures in the game tremble in your presence. Meanwhile, in Dark Souls, two skeletons, corner. This means that you're never too good or too strong to get destroyed in some hilarious and deeply embarrassing way by the least threatening things in the game. Conversely, it also means you can always have a sense of pride in getting through battle relatively unscathed. And the Dark Souls community is usually spectacularly kind to its own, with multiple people always willing to provide tips or serve as actual summoning partners to those who are having a hard time with the boss. However, this also has its negative side. The most dedicated and helpful Dark Souls players are also those who've played the game the most and have overcome its biggest challenges, and are thus the ones most likely to be overly defensive of the game. The result is a community that, while friendly, can often be overly defensive, one that will often dismiss criticism of the game's mechanics as little more than sour grapes. Get good has become a meme for a very good reason. And while this isn't a gameplay mechanic per se, games make their own community, and in all games, and especially in a game like Dark Souls, the community is an inseparable part of playing the game.
Like quicksand in there.
What is an inherent gameplay mechanic is how Dark Souls treats its ending, which is perhaps more telling of its attitude than anything else. Upon defeating Gwyn, the player can decide to either link the First Flame again, which is only a temporary reprieve against the dark, or submit to the latter, essentially turning all humans into murderous animals, roaming the world in search of prey. Dark Souls both sides us one final time, showing us that whatever we decide to do with humanity, we simply end up at square one. Yes indeed, the dark sign binds the undead, just as Dark Souls binds us as well, to continue to roam its world, looking for increasingly tougher enemies to fight under increasingly ludicrous self-imposed conditions for absolutely no good reason. Until we are spent.